Hey there. I wanted to show how to install Kali Linux on a Raspberry Pi. A lot of Raspberry Pi models can run Kali Linux, but I'll be using a Raspberry Pi 5 here. Everything in this video was tested on a Raspberry Pi 4 as well, so that one should work fine too though. Do note that there are a bunch of videos about setting up Kali Linux on a Raspberry Pi, but a lot of these assume that you have an extra monitor and special HDMI cables, and then they'll also have you set up Wi-Fi after you've already installed and logged into Kali. Well, personally, I think those ways are really inconvenient, so I'll show how to install Kali Linux, have it auto-connect to your Wi-Fi on boot, and then connect to it with SSH. Of course, only SSH is not always ideal, so I'll also show how to set up remote desktops so that you can have a full desktop experience even without a second monitor. As to what I need, I'll be setting everything up using a Windows 11 computer. I need a micro SD card to hold Kali. I have a Samsung 64GB one. Of course, you'll need some way to attach the SD card to the computer. If you don't have a built-in SD card reader, you could pick up a micro SD card USB adapter like this one. These are actually pretty cheap online. Next, of course, I need to download Kali. I'll head to the Kali website and download the ARM version for my Pi model. The Kali ISO image is compressed by default though, so I need to extract it, but I can just use the default Windows extraction tool. As far as software goes, first I need a copy of the official Raspberry Pi imager. I will need this to flash the Kali image to the SD card. And lastly, I need a copy of Notepad++. I'll need to edit some Kali image configuration files, and Notepad++ will let me properly edit those files from Windows without creating Linux boot compatibility issues. This might sound complicated, but it's not. More on this later. Okay, let's get started. You should be on Windows with the Raspberry Pi imager open. Note, I am using version 2.0.4. Make sure the SD card is plugged in, of course. First thing here though, I will go to App Options, and then make sure that Eject Media when finished is turned off, and turn off telemetry if you want. Then go ahead and choose your Raspberry Pi model. It doesn't actually matter here. For operating system, scroll all the way down, and then look for Use a Custom Image from your computer, and choose that Kali ARM image that you extracted earlier. Next, just choose the SD card. And we are going to write this, but do note that anything on the SD card will be deleted. You can ignore any pop-ups. Once the SD card is flashed, I can hit Finish, and then I'll open up Notepad++. And from here, I need to open a file. And make sure you're looking inside of the SD card, but scroll all the way down and look for a file called user data. And it's right here. So this is a spot to customize some installation options. If you wanted to, you could change the host name of the Pi, but I'll leave it as the default. Since I'm doing a headless install and won't be hooking the Pi up to a monitor, I will need to add a couple lines here. First one would be enable SSH true. Just make sure that the SSH server is enabled at boot, and then I will add SSH pwauth true. This line enables password SSH authentication. Do note right here the user stanza. This has default listed, meaning that the default username and password will just be Kali. I will go ahead and save and close this. In Notepad++, you should see some green lines here indicating that your changes were saved. Now I need to make a new config file so that my Pi will connect to Wi-Fi. If you don't need Wi-Fi, you can just skip this part, but I will just save this current file. But I will just go to Save As, and make sure I'm saving it to the SD card. But Save As type, make sure you choose all types. Then I will name the file wpa-supplicant.conf. This next part is why I need a Notepad++. Go to Edit, then look for EOL conversion, which is end-of-line conversion, and make sure Unix is selected. And you should see it displaying Unix in the bottom here now. So end-of-line characters are invisible to humans by default, but they do differ between Linux and Windows. If you had Windows end-of-lines, Linux can sometimes ignore the configuration files. If you don't do this, it's very likely that this file would be ignored at boot and your Pi won't connect to the Wi-Fi network. This WPA supplicant file just contains my Wi-Fi configs. I'll paste them in here, but this is what it should look like. So just network equals curly brace, and your SSIDs, your Wi-Fi name. The next line is PSK, which is pre-shared key, so that's your Wi-Fi password. And end it all with a curly brace. And do note that the SSID and PSK values are enclosed in double quotes. There's one more thing I can do here to make sure the EOL is correct. You can go to View, Show Symbol, Show End of Line, and you should see LF, which would be for Unix. So if yours doesn't look like mine, there's a problem. But we are done here, so I can go ahead and save this. And I will close it out. Just for one more quick check that everything is in place, I can open up File Explorer, look at my SD card, scroll all the way down, and make sure that my wpasupplicant.com file is present, which mine is. So I will go ahead and eject the SD card now. Next, make sure your Raspberry Pi is unplugged. Then put the SD card into it and turn it on. It is important that the Pi was not already plugged in when you put in the SD card, because that can mess with the boot sequence. At this point, I'll just wait like 2 minutes for the Pi to go through its first boot and connect to the network before doing anything else. By this point, if everything was done correctly, I should be able to SSH into my Raspberry Pi now. So I just have a command prompt open, and first I'll try using the DNS name of the Pi. So SSH Kali at Kali Raspberry Pi. Remember, this is the host name that was set inside of that user data file, so if you changed it, you're going to have to put something different here. I will hit enter. Yes, I want to verify the key. Put my password. And I'm in. Note, if you saw an error here, like you couldn't resolve the Pi's hostname, it likely means that there's a DNS issue. It likely means that your local router is not resolving your Pi's hostname. And if your computer can't resolve the Pi's DNS name, you're probably going to have to try SSHing in with the IP address. Just a quick little reference for you, if you weren't sure how to find the IP address easily, I think the easiest way is probably just going to be to log onto your router's admin panel. And like this is an example of mine, and I can see the Raspberry Pi IP right here. Yours will look different though. And if that still doesn't work and you've waited a while, at that point I'd recommend reflashing the SD card and going through that process again, since it's very likely there's a typo in either the user data or wpasupplicant.com file. By this point, Kali should be installed and we have SSH access. But now we can set up remote desktop access. Note, if you're running Kali on one of the weaker Pis like a 02W, you probably don't want to set up RDP since the Pi specs are so low. But if you're on a stronger one, first we should update Kali. So run sudo apt update and sudo apt upgrade -y and just let this finish. After that is done, I can go ahead and clear my screen real quick. Okay, now we can install a tool called XRDP. So I will just run sudo apt install xrdp-y. XRDP is installed. Now we need to enable the service. So it is sudo systemctl enable XRDP. Enter on that. Service should be enabled. Now we need to start the service. So sudo systemctl start XRDP. XRDP should be started and enabled. We can verify this by running sudo systemctl status XRDP. And we should see XRDP service enabled and active running. And if we look at the logs here at the bottom, we can see it is listening on quad 0 and then port 3389. So with all this information, we know that XRDP should be working. And for the moment of truth, let's RDP into the Pi using Windows. I will go to the search bar and search for remote desktop connection. I can open this, and here I can put either the DNS name or the IP address for a computer. So for me, Kali Raspberry Pi. I won't go in and change any other settings, I'll just leave it default. But I'll try to connect. Yes, I trust the connection. I should see this screen, so I'll put in my username and password. And you should see a remote desktop connection. I should note that remote desktop can be a bit bandwidth heavy. So the slower your network connection is, the slower your experience will be. It's not like you should be doing things like watching YouTubes on remote desktop on a Raspberry Pi anyway. Well, that's about it for this video. I should note that you don't need the Raspberry Pi imager to flash Kali to the SD card. Other tools like Boolean Etcher should work just fine too, but I decided to use the Pi imager anyway since it's a multi-purpose tool and it's only one download. There is some Kali image already baked into the Raspberry Pi imager. However, at the time of my testing, there are some annoying networking issues when running on Wi-Fi, so I decided not to include this way. I also did want to point out that the way I set up RDP in this demo, any device on the network could try to RDP in. Of course, they'd still need a username and password though, but since the default username and password is Cali, this is not very secure. So I'd recommend making a new user account, or at least changing the default Cali user's password. The same concept applies to SSH and having default credentials. But stuff like that is way less of a concern in a home lab environment, or just playing around at home on your local network. But I figured I'd call it out anyway. If you felt like learning more about securing RDP access, you could modify the XRDP config file to be more specific, like giving an IP whitelist, or look into the built-in Linux host-based firewall options such as IP tables and UFW. Either way, hopefully you got Kelly working on a Raspberry Pi, and hopefully you learned something.